Ever feel like your brain is just this crazy mix of every idea you've ever come across? You know, like your childhood stuff you read, beliefs you're not even sure you agree with. It gets kind of messy.
It really does.
Well, today's deep dive, we're talking about a guy who not only lived that, but shaped like centuries of Western thought because of it. St. Augustine of Hippo.
And he did it all while the Roman Empire was falling apart around him.
Can you imagine?
Talk about a time to think about the big questions, right?
Seriously, it's like the ultimate, what do I even value when everything's a disaster situation? But before we get to all that, let's start with Augustine, the man himself, born in 354 AD in North Africa.
Completely different world.
Totally. We've got these excerpts, right, that really dig into his philosophy. Honestly, the guy was a walking contradiction sometimes.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, take his family life.
Yeah, fascinating.
Devoutly Christian mother, pagan father.
Oh, yeah, the dinner table debates in that house, I can only imagine.
Right. No wonder Augustine was wrestling with these big questions from, like, childhood.
From the very beginning.
And wrestle he did. Our sources say he was pretty wild in his younger years, then got really into Manichaeism.
Right.
Which, for those of you who, like me, needed a little refresher, it was a religion big on this whole cosmic battle of good versus evil, light versus dark, all that.
It was a big deal.
Huge back then.
Yeah.
So he's got this background, right?
Yeah.
And it really impacted him.
It had a deep impact on his early thinking, yeah, even though he later rejected it. But this idea of the universe as like a battleground between these two equal forces, good and evil, I mean, that's something he grappled with throughout his life, even as he developed his own ideas within Christianity.
It makes you wonder, like, if you're raised with a certain worldview, how much of that stays with you even when you find a new path?
Oh, for sure. It's always there.
Anyway, Augustine eventually converts to Christianity. And get this, he's heavily influenced by the ideas of Plato.
Of course, yeah.
Talk about a plot twist.
Yeah?
This is where his journey gets really interesting.
It does, and this is where you see his genius, I think. Because he doesn't just abandon his old way of thinking, right? He finds ways to integrate what he learned from Manichaeism, from Platonism, into this new understanding of Christianity.
So it's all connected.
It's all connected. Like, for example, you see that emphasis on the spiritual realm in Platonism. Augustine, he sees that reflected in the city of God.
Okay, we're definitely going to unpack that whole city of God concept a little bit later. Sounds juicy. But first, let's talk about something that really makes Augustine stand out. He wasn't afraid to use his brain.
No, he is not.
Like, we have this quote, right? I believe in order to understand.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Which I think perfectly sums up his whole approach to faith and reason.
Absolutely. He was not about blind faith at all. Augustine was convinced that reason wasn't the enemy of faith, but like its partner.
They go together.
Yeah, they work together. He even goes so far as to say that faith is like the starting point, right? The foundation, and reason is how we build on that.
Okay, I like that.
He uses this analogy of light and vision. Just as light lets us see the world around us, faith illuminates our understanding of God and spiritual truths.
So it's not about like blindly accepting things, but using your reason to go deeper, to make those beliefs actually mean something.
Exactly. It's about asking the hard questions, challenging your own assumptions, really using your intellect to understand the why behind the what. And you see this in all his work.
Yeah.
He's constantly wrestling with these complex theological questions, exploring different interpretations of Scripture, using logic and reason to try to make sense of the divine.
Which honestly is kind of refreshing to hear, especially when you're talking about religious figures from that time period.
Right.
Makes him feel more relatable.
Absolutely, more human.
Right.
And I think that's a big reason why his work still resonates today. He's not just like preaching at us from on high.
No.
He's right there with us, grappling with these same big questions about faith, doubt, the nature of existence. And speaking of big questions, we've got to talk about Augustine's ideas about time.
Oh, boy.
Get ready, because this one's a real head-scratcher.
You're telling me, from what I've read, he was basically a time traveler stuck in the 5th century.
Right. Way ahead of his time, this guy. Augustine's concept of time is mind-blowing, even by today's standards. He's basically arguing that God exists outside of time.
Whoa.
In this eternal present.
Okay.
So for God, it's always now, which for us time-bound humans
Right.
is a lot to wrap your head around.
It's like trying to imagine a world without clocks or calendars where past, present, future, it's all happening at once.
It's a lot.
How did he even begin to explain that?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. So, Augustine argued that while God experiences all of time simultaneously, we humans, we experience it linearly,
Okay.
moment by moment.
Okay.
But this is key. He believed our memory allows us to access something beyond that linear flow.
So our memories are like
This
this
is
secret passage or something?
Kind of. For Augustine, memory is more than just recalling past events. It's a way of connecting to something eternal.
So you're saying our memories are like a bridge to that eternal now that God exists in.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where it gets even more fascinating.
Yeah.
Because this idea, it gets tied into his understanding of the soul.
Okay, hold on, souls. I knew this deep dive was going to get kind of deep, but I wasn't expecting to have an existential crisis today.
Well, Augustine was a bishop, so these big questions about life and death, that was kind of his thing.
True, true.
But yeah, no, we're not going full ghost hunters here. The point is how he connects this whole memory and eternity thing back to us, to being human.
Okay.
So because we remember, because we can tap into something beyond just this moment, he's saying that suggests that we, like God, have a soul that exists outside of time.
So like a little piece of eternity is tucked away inside all of us. That's actually a kind of nice thought. But then that brings up the big question, right? If our souls are eternal, if God is all good, then why is there so much suffering? Why is there evil in the world? That was something Augustine really struggled with, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a question that's plagued philosophers and theologians for centuries. Actually, even today, right? You see it everywhere you look, people trying to make sense of it all. And Augustine, he came up with an answer. And it's one that's still debated today.
Okay, so remind me, what was his take? You said earlier that he didn't believe evil was something God created. So where does it fit in with this whole eternal soul, all-powerful God idea?
Yeah, so for Augustine to understand evil, you have to understand what it's not. He didn't see it as this thing, like a substance or an entity or some independent force.
Okay.
He saw it as the absence of good.
The absence of good. So like it's not really there, it's just like missing goodness.
Exactly. It's like, think of a sculpture. A sculptor starts with a block of marble, something perfect and whole, right? And to create the sculpture, they chip away at the marble. Those chips that are removed, they're not inherently bad, but they're incomplete. They're lacking the full potential of what they could be, what the sculptor envisioned. Evil, for Augustine, is like those chips, the privation of good.
So the act of chipping away, of removing from that original goodness, that's where evil comes in.
Exactly. And for Augustine, that act of chipping away a lot of times came down to our choices.
Our choices.
Yeah, he was a big believer in free will, this idea that humans have the capacity to choose between good and evil, to do good or to cause harm.
Right. But then we often choose, well, we know how that goes.
Right. We often miss the mark, and Augustine had a term for that, original sin. But it wasn't some blame game going all the way back to Adam and Eve. He saw it more as this inherited flaw in our nature, this inclination to choose the incomplete over the complete, the darkness over the light.
Okay. I mean, it's true. It does sometimes feel like we're hardwired to make bad choices. So where does that leave us?
That's where Augustine brings in another one of his big ideas, divine grace.
We've all heard that term, but what does it really mean? Is it like a get out of jail free card for messing up?
Not exactly. It's more like, think of it as a lifeline. Augustine believed that God, in his infinite mercy, doesn't just leave us to struggle alone with our flawed nature, with our tendency to mess up.
So he gives us a little help.
Exactly. He extends his grace to us, a kind of divine assistance to help us choose good, to resist those temptations that lead us astray, and ultimately to help us find our way back to him.
So it's not that we lose our free will, but grace helps us to use it for good, to want better for ourselves and others.
Precisely. He's saying that we're not just stuck with these bad choices or this flawed nature, but we have this amazing capacity for good, and grace is kind of like that little voice inside us, nudging us, encouraging us to choose that better path.
That makes a lot more sense. So it's not that we're bad or we're doomed from the start, but we have this potential for both, and grace is kind of that guiding hand helping us to make those better choices.
Exactly. We're all works in progress, constantly being shaped by the choices we make, by the grace that's available to us. And Augustine believed that it's through this process, this dance between our will and God's grace, that we can really become who we were created to be.
That's really beautiful. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about Augustine's most famous work, The City of God. Now, this wasn't just some abstract philosophical treatise, was it? He wrote it as Rome was literally crumbling around him.
That's right. Talk about timing, right? Barbarians at the gates, the empire in chaos, and Augustine sits down to write this massive work exploring the nature of power, justice, the meaning of history itself.
Wow, it's like the ultimate, what do I value when everything's falling apart situation, right?
It really is. And what's so fascinating is that for Augustine, the fall of Rome wasn't actually the main point. As dramatic and traumatic as it was almost like a backdrop for this much larger conversation he was having.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What was this bigger conversation? What was the grand idea that Augustine was exploring amidst the collapse of an empire?
He called it the city of God.
The city of God. It sounds a little, I don't know, like a fantasy novel or something. What was he getting at with this whole city idea?
Well, imagine two cities, each representing a different way of living, different values, different destinies. One city is all about worldly power, material wealth, immediate gratification. It's flashy, seductive, but it's ultimately temporary, built on things that can crumble.
Sounds a lot like the Roman Empire he was watching fall apart.
Exactly. And Augustine, he saw firsthand how easily those things could disappear, how fleeting they really are. And then on the other hand, he envisioned this other city, the city of God. This city wasn't defined by physical boundaries or material possessions. It was a spiritual reality, a community of souls united by their love for God and their pursuit of something more lasting, more true.
Okay, so it's like this tale of two cities, each vying for our allegiance, our attention. But you're saying that Augustine believed that one was ultimately more real than the other.
In a sense, yes. The city of God for Augustine wasn't just some idealistic dream or a far-off utopia. It represented the ultimate reality, the only city that truly mattered. The other city, with all its allure and its temptations, it was ultimately a distraction, a detour on the path to true fulfillment.
It's like he was saying, sure, you can build your house on sand, but don't be surprised when the tide comes in.
Exactly, and I think that's why the city of God resonated so strongly with people, even centuries after the fall of Rome. It speaks to this deep longing we all have for something that endures, something that transcends the chaos and uncertainty of life in this world.
It's incredible to think that he was wrestling with these ideas way back in the 5th century, and they're still so relevant today. It's like he was having a conversation with the future, and we're all still part of it.
Absolutely, and I think there's a powerful message for us in that, right? That even in the midst of all the craziness, all the uncertainty, there's a deeper truth, a more enduring reality that we can hold on to. And it's by engaging with these big questions, with these timeless ideas, that we can start to build our own city of God in our own lives and our own communities.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from Augustine's wild youth to his incredible insights about faith, about reason, about good, evil, time, the very meaning of human existence.
He was an amazing thinker. He wasn't afraid to ask the hard questions or grapple with the messy realities of life.
And that's what's so inspiring about him, right? He reminds us that it's okay to wrestle with doubt, to embrace the complexities, to never stop seeking truth. And that's really what this deep dive is all about. It's about diving into these rich, challenging ideas and seeing how they can illuminate our own lives, even centuries later. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought from Augustine himself. The truth is to be sought with a mind free from prejudice. So keep searching, keep questioning, keep exploring those big questions, and we'll see you on our next deep dive. The City of God, it sounds kind of more like a fantasy novel than a philosophical treatise, to be honest. What was Augustine actually getting at with this whole city metaphor?
Okay, so imagine two cities, right? Each one represents a totally different way of living, different values, different destinies. The first city, he calls it the earthly city.
Okay.
And it's all about what we see in the world, power, wealth, instant gratification. It's flashy, it's seductive, but Augustine saw it as temporary.
Because it's built on things that can crumble.
Exactly, like the Roman Empire he was watching fall apart all around him.
Talk about a real-life example, right?
Right. And then he contrasts that with this other city he calls the city of God.
Okay.
And this one, it's not about physical stuff or borders on a map. It's about something deeper. A spiritual reality, he calls it. A community of souls who are united not by their possessions or their power, but by their love for God, their desire for something more real, more true, more lasting.
So it's like we have these two cities, right, both calling out to us, vying for our attention, our allegiance.
It's a constant tug of war.
But Augustine believed that one of these cities, the city of God, was ultimately more real.
He did. He saw the city of God not as some far-off utopia or a naive dream, but as the ultimate reality. The earthly city with all its glitz and glamour, that was the distraction. A detour on the road to what really matters.
It makes you think about where you're putting your energy, right?
Yeah.
What you're building your life on.
Absolutely. And I think that's a huge part of why the city of God still resonates with people all these centuries later. It's about that longing we all feel deep down for something lasting, something that gives us a firm foundation, even when everything around us seems shaky.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Faith, reason, good, evil, the nature of time. And we've really just scratched the surface of who Augustine was and what he grappled with.
He was a pretty amazing thinker, and the times he lived in, they weren't that different from our own when you think about it.
Right. Constant change, uncertainty, people searching for meaning. Sounds pretty familiar.
It does, doesn't it? And what Augustine reminds us is that in the midst of all of that, we don't have to abandon our reason, our intellect.
We can embrace the big questions.
Absolutely. And in doing so, we might just find a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
So keep searching, keep questioning, keep exploring. Those big questions Augustine raised, they're still worth pondering.
They are. And who knows, you might discover something amazing along the way.
And we will see you on our next deep dive.